Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. You are here for the Forest Carbon Coalition webinar called What Are Industrial Forest Practices Costing Us? And we will be focusing on the climate and societal costs of logging. My name is Heather Campbell. I'm the coordinator for the Forest Carbon Coalition, or FCC for short. We are a national coalition of over 100 organizations and individuals who are working on climate change solutions from a science and economics perspective. Our panelists today are all economists and are well known in this circle when it comes to climate change. And each panelist will have about 20 minutes to give their presentation. That will be followed by a 30-minute Q&A. And I just wanted to do a couple housekeeping reminders. The chat is turned off, but the Q&A is open, and you may submit questions at any time throughout the presentation, and we will get to as many questions as we can during the Q&A period. If you are interested in becoming an FCC member, if you're not already, you can do that one of two ways. You can either email me directly, heather@forestcarboncoalition.org, or you can go to our website, and on the homepage, you can click on Become a Member and fill out the form that way. Any difficulties, technical difficulties, anything that arises, please drop a note into the Q&A so we can see that, because the chat, like I said, is turned off. So we are going to start with Dr. John Talberth today, who will be followed by Dr. Kate Anderson, and then we will finish up with Ernie Niemi and then start the Q&A at that time. So Dr. Talberth is the president and senior economist at the Center for a Sustainable Economy. He's also one of the founding directors of the Forest Carbon Coalition. He works on forest carbon policy and advocacy based on the underlying science and economics, and he has been working on protecting ancient forests in the Pacific Northwest since the 80s. So John, I will turn it over to you and you can get started.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Heather. And it's good to be here. And thank you all for attending. So I presume most of you by now have received the memo about the climate consequences of clear-cutting and other industrial practices. But if not, I'm going to spend just a little bit of time reviewing the evidence and then jump into some of the economic policy tools available to address the problem and drastically scale up what we call climate-smart alternatives. Kate will then take over and do a deeper dive on one of these alternatives, long rotations, and Ernie will then conclude about the economic imperative of making the transition. So to begin with, let's define terms. The term industrial logging does not include the small-scale extraction of wood by family foresters, small community and tribal organizations, land trusts, or most conservation organizations. What we're talking about is the large-scale intensive extraction of wood by Wall Street and increasingly foreign investor-owned corporations that rely on clear-cutting, dense networks of logging roads, chemicals, fertilizers, slash burning, and heavy machinery, all to fuel mass consumption of wood products across the nation and the world. So what these entities are doing is not forestry, but tree farming, and it makes a big difference to climate and biodiversity. So the scale of the damage is mind-boggling and being felt in every part of the US. Take a look at the landscapes near Richmond, Virginia on the right, Hot Springs, Arkansas in the middle, and Seaside, Oregon on the left. Everything in red has been clear-cut in the past 20 years. Here's a close-up. Note the labyrinth of logging roads that are taking carbon sequestration completely off the table for permanently. Here's a drinking watershed on the Oregon coast. My takeaway message, overall takeaway message here, is that the climate consequences of this economic activity are severe and long-lasting and are putting constant upward pressure on CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere at the very time in history that climate scientists are telling us we need to do everything we can to protect forests and draw down CO2 back below the scientific upper limit of 350 parts per million. So to understand why industrial tree farming is so bad for climate, it's important to distinguish between the forest carbon dynamics we inherited from nature with the industrial tree farming model that has replaced it over so much of the land. The top panel, A, represents the natural forest carbon cycle. Natural forests in various age classes pull in massive amounts of CO2 from the atmosphere, give off some through disturbances like fire and decomposition, but end up pulling in far more that they give off for thousands of years and store most of that carbon in the soils, which rely on these dense networks of mycorrhizal fungi to pump the carbon from above ground to below ground and transfer carbon that way. Now, in one recent study, researchers that looked at the history of forest carbon in the Midwest concluded that this process probably built up Midwestern forest carbon stocks for at least 8,000 years, and probably back to the beginning of the current interglacial period. So think of this nature's baseline forest carbon dynamic as a catch and store regime. Now think of the industrial, hold on, let me go back here. Thank you. Think of the industrial forest carbon cycle, panel B, as the opposite, a catch, release, and deplete regime. Fair cuts deforest the land, release stored carbon to the atmosphere, and create carbon sequestration dead zones that give off rather than capture carbon. Plantations absorb carbon for a while, but then they are cut down and converted into wood products by industrial processes that release both fossil and biogenic carbon stored in trees. The soil carbon accumulation process comes to a halt and then reverses as forest productivity decline and soil carbon bleeds off the land through erosion. The land is also made more susceptible to wildfires, which give off more carbon than they would otherwise. So in that Midwestern study, the researchers found that after accumulating carbon for 8,000 years, the land's lost most of these stocks in just 150 years due to logging and conversion to agriculture. So the degradation of nature's forest carbon cycle is well reflected in a variety of metrics, and none of this is seriously disputed. They can be divided into two camps. The first camp being the ways in which industrial tree farming drives climate change by pumping up atmospheric CO2 levels, and the second camp being the ways clear cutting and timber plantations make the land more susceptible to climate change. But the basic story is this: industrial tree farming results in far less carbon being stored in the land, far greater greenhouse gas emissions, and far less carbon sequestration than nature's baseline. And landscapes dominated by clear cuts, tree plantations, and logging roads are far more vulnerable to a variety of climate stressors. They increase fire risks, deplete water supplies, increase water temperatures, degrade water quality, amplify heat waves, and increase the threats from flooding and landslides. So with limited time here, I can't do a deep dive in any of these, but I can give you a sneak peek as to the data and information out there. Let's start with carbon storage. Everywhere in the US, the logging of the original forest has released many billion tons of CO2 and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and created major carbon storage deficit on the land. In the Pacific Northwest, this resulted in a loss of at least 5.5 gigatons of carbon from the land to the atmosphere through about 1990, with the logging of our massive original ancient forests. The most intensively logged lands now exhibit forest carbon stocks measured in metric tons per acre that are about a third of what used to exist in our old growth forests. Now, these practices have also created a carbon sequestration deficit with the most heavily logged lands in Western Oregon. And I'm using a lot of examples from Oregon, so just bear with me here. But these facts are true in many different parts of the country. So in Oregon, we now see that most heavily logged lands barely breaking even on carbon accumulation every year, while natural forests probably pulled in about 6 or 7 tons CO2 per acre for every ton given off by wildfire decay. The difference shown here at about 6 tons CO2 per acre per year is the amount of CO2 no longer being taken out of the atmosphere by real forests that plantations have replaced. And of course, this drives up CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. Now, one of the reasons carbon sequestration capacity on landscapes dominated by industrial tree plantations is so much less than a natural forest is because of carbon sequestration dead zones, which are logging roads and recently clear-cut lands that have stopped capturing carbon altogether and are in fact giving it off. As shown in this graph of net ecosystem productivity before and after logging on the left, these dead zones persist for 10 to 15 years after a forest is clear-cut. In these clear-cuts, the land gives off more carbon than it can capture as dead branches, needles, stumps, and slash decay or are burned, and as the soil begins to release its vast stores. So importantly, and this is the table on the right, the extent of these dead zones increases as the timber rotation, the amount of time between clear cutting the same site, falls. So at a 40-year rotation, as you can see, about a third of the land at any one time is a source, not a sink for carbon. So this is why these industrial forest landscapes are so much less valuable from a carbon sequestration standpoint than our natural forests. And because of this, while long rotations still create these dead zones, their aerial extent is half of what it would be at a 40-year rotation, which has major implications for forest policy, as Kate will discuss. So industrial tree farming has greatly reduced both stocks on the land and carbon sequestration relative to nature's baseline. But what about emissions? Well, nature doesn't log, of course. So all of the greenhouse gas emissions triggered by logging activities is excess CO2 entering the atmosphere. And it's not hard to calculate these emissions. Trees are half carbon by weight, and when they are cut down and turned into wood products and eventually disposed of in landfills, 75% or so of the original carbon in the forest ends up in the atmosphere as the wood decays and as the wood in the forest and the slash left behind decays as well. Clear cuts, as we just discussed, give off rather than sequester carbon, and after logging, sites are often burned and then sprayed. So soil carbon runs off from these logging roads and unstable slopes. In addition, the whole process is mechanized and lots of fossil fuels are burned along the way. In a study we completed in 2017, we found that just on the biogenic carbon account alone, Oregon's logging related emissions were by far the largest single source in the state. A year later, OSU put out a now well-known study corroborating these figures. So now let's turn to the vast pool of research connecting industrial tree farming with climate stressors. Oh, and just one last point. Of course, these emissions are not actually tallied in official greenhouse gas inventories. So let's take heat waves in terms of one of these climate stressors. We're all familiar with how hot it is in open clear-cut areas versus natural forests, but the effect is pretty extreme. Studies dating back to the 1980s have quantified that this temperature differential in the hottest times of year could be 40 to 50 degrees, and that's a major factor in as we get into a regime with more and more of these heat domes. And in a recent study we did with OSU professor Christopher Still, another conclusion from the study was not only that we had these extreme temperature differentials, but the actual carbon sequestration comes to a halt entirely because the heat is so intense that these new plantations stop growing. So that's a major concern with heat waves. Water shortages, we've all heard the research. Industrial tree plantations also make water shortages worse. The paired watershed studies have consistently documented a 50% decrease in dry season water supply when natural forests are converted to tree plantations. Wildfire risk, contrary to what the timber industry argues, industrial tree farming does not reduce but increases fire risk. Heavily clear-cut areas are also much more prone to flooding and landslide. Clear cutting on unstable soils has been shown to increase landslide risk by 200 to 400% relative to nature's baseline. So these are some of the ways industrial tree farming model is amplifying the effects of climate change, and there are many more. But enough bad news. So let's turn to the solutions and how economic policy can be used to scale those up. So the overarching solution is what is known as climate smart forestry. Some people don't like that term. I get it, but I think it's a pretty apt description of what we need to be doing. We need to be smart about climate impacts. So unlike tree farming, climate smart forestry is more in line with the notion of an honorable harvest, as author Robin Kimmerer has so eloquently described, where we take what we need from the land, but leave a functioning forest behind. Climate smart practices include a variety of techniques capable of advancing 4 distinct climate goals simultaneously: reducing emissions, increasing carbon stored in the land, enhancing carbon sequestration, and making the land more resilient to climate change. They include techniques like afforestation, reforestation, long rotations, alternatives to clear cutting, restoration of plantations back into real forests, proforestation, which is just simply allowing trees to grow big and tall, and setting aside, of course, the most productive forest lands as forest carbon reserves. So how do we make climate smart forestry? Oh, and let me just focus on one of these techniques, alternatives to clear cutting. Variable density thinning is one that checks off all those boxes. It has the promise of creating structural diversity out of homogeneous timber plantations, thereby enhancing climate resilience. It accelerates the growth of big old growth trees, carbon-rich trees to increase carbon storage. It produces wood with less of a carbon footprint, which reduces emissions. So all 4 climate smart goals we discussed are advanced through variable density thinning. Okay, so how do we make climate smart forestry the rule and not the exception? Well, the good news is that there are many economic policy tools available to decision makers at the federal, state, and local level. Here are a few that I think are the most important. Demand reduction, of course. The amount of wood we waste is astonishing. Market-based mechanisms such as subsidy reform, forest carbon taxes, and cap and trade. Limiting ownership of our prime forest and farmland by short-sighted corporate investors. Using land use tools such as no net loss and zoning to protect public health and safety. So let me just touch on a couple of these, beginning with demand reduction and substitution. Just like our use of fossil fuels, there's great potential to reduce wasteful consumption of wood and paper products, which are by far the largest component of US landfills. Remarkably, 1 out of every 2 trees cut down in the US is for paper, packaging, or biomass burning. Urban sprawl and oversized houses also represent a wasteful use of wood. And contrary to the timber industry's claims, wood and paper products are not less carbon intensive than concrete, steel, coal-fired electricity, or alternative papers. If you take into account the biogenic carbon in the wood itself, it's not even close. A ton of wood that arrives at a job site comes with a carbon price tag of 8 or 9 tons CO2. Concrete and steel are actually far less. Woody biomass has been shown to be more carbon intensive than coal for electricity, and alternative papers like hemp, conifer, bamboo are far less carbon intensive as well. So demand reduction involves not only reducing waste, but substituting these less carbon intensive inputs whenever possible. And then there are market-based solutions that are already being advocated for with respect to fossil fuel emissions. So there's no reason why logging and wood products emissions cannot be targeted for these as well. In 2017, we convinced some legislators in Oregon to draft a bill establishing a forest carbon tax and reward program that would levy a tax on corporate logging-related emissions to capitalize a forest carbon incentive fund that would be used to reward climate-smart practices on non-industrial lands. The bill would incentivize long rotations and other good practices by exempting volume extracted from lands enrolled in long-term carbon storage agreements. We estimated that this program could generate hundreds of millions of dollars each year. If you take a look at our analysis down here, for small forest landowners. So this could be a big ticket way to capitalize a fund to expedite the transition to climate smart forestry. The other market-based solution we hear a lot about is forest carbon cap and trade. We could do that with the timber industry emissions as well. Here we could establish a declining cap on emissions with the goal of cutting logging levels down in half by, say, 2050, perhaps limiting the practice of cutting down trees for paper and woody biomass energy for the most part. That would be our 50% cut by 2050. And as with existing offset programs, a portion of an entity's compliance obligations in a given year could be met by purchasing offset credits generated by substituting hemp fiber, bamboo, carbon negative concrete, and other less carbon intensive products for wood. Another market-based solution is having a no net loss compensatory mitigation program to address the conversion of prime forest and farmland to development, like we now have for wetlands. So here's how it might work using a local development project as an example. We would calculate both the carbon removed by development and the stream of sequestration being displaced over a given time period, say 100 years. The developer would then be required to pay into a fund to protect or restore a carbon equivalent amount of land or farmland, if it's a farmland being developed, to ensure that those lands were enrolled in long-term carbon storage agreements. So this is something we already have in place for wetlands. Why not do it for forests and farmland as well? Another promising strategy involves the use of local government's land use planning authority. Through land use plans and zoning, there's a good case to be made that counties have the authority and duty to restrict industrial tree farming to where other types of farming takes place on our agricultural lands, and reserve forest lands for climate smart practices, climate smart forestry, not tree farming. So this will help reduce the public health and safety risks from wildfires, heat waves, landslides, floods, chemical contamination, and depleted water supplies that nearby communities are now suffering due to proximity to industrial forest practices. So anyway, that's all the time I have, and I'd be happy to drill down on these solutions more in the Q&A. But for now, I think I'll turn it back over to Heather and then Kate. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. Appreciate your presentation. Participants, I didn't mention earlier that we will have the presentations available for you. So each of the speakers' presentations will be sent along with the recording of the webinar. So if anyone had that question, there you go. We will send those out along with the recording. So next we have Dr. Kate Anderson, and Kate leads the Farms and Forest Research Program at the Sightline Institute. She has a double Ph.D. in Sociology and Environment and Resources and a master's in Agriculture and Applied Economics. She's an expert on institutional tools that promote both the vibrant rural communities and also environmental sustainability. She's researched climate, biodiversity, water, and land use for the National Science Foundation Long-Term Ecological Research Program, the United Nations Development Program, and the Brazilian government. And Kate's going to talk to us about one of the alternative solutions that John was mentioning. So Kate, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Heather. I'll share my screen. Okay, that looks good. And thank you, John, for an excellent presentation. So Sightline's Farms and Forest Research Program focuses on holistic solutions on working lands that jointly improve carbon sequestration, clear and bountiful water, habitat, and of course, flourishing human communities. We often investigate innovative solutions that already exist, such as long harvest rotations, as John was talking about. Our work is to tell the stories of their practitioners and to analyze what kinds of policies or market nudges could help these systems scale up. This year, we focused on figuring out how to grow older trees, specifically how to extend timber harvest rotations on private industrial lands. So I was invited to join this panel because conventional short rotations are a good example of how industrial timber practices can be, in economists' lingo, economically inefficient, aka a net economic loss to society as a whole. On the other hand, long rotations exemplify how some ecological alternatives that are completely within reach can be more economically beneficial, more rational, and just more practical. The goal of today's panel, one of the goals of today's panel, is to present a specific set of tools, those of economics. And we're not focusing on economics because it paints the complete picture, but rather because it tells an important part of the story. I've encountered, or actually studies have shown that often antagonists of ecological forestry assume that forest advocates, while perhaps well-intentioned and well-meaning, are impractical and basically out of touch with reality. But the reality is that some conventional forest practices actually cost more and contribute less to society in a mathematically calculatable way. So we're presenting some tools that might be useful to counter and disarm these arguments, to connect with a broader range of people and to win policy gains. Extending rotations is a more ecological practice and is more economically beneficial, even judged by the narrow criteria of economic policy. This is a Google Earth image of the Santiam River watershed in Oregon. You can see that nearly every acre is in some stage of growth after a clear cut. The reality is that most privately owned forests in the Pacific Northwest are plantations, meaning that cash monocrops of trees are repeatedly planted, cared for with fertilizer and herbicides, and then clear cut. What if there were a way to reduce by half the amount of clear cutting on private lands? That would mean half as much pesticides, double the habitat, and more protection for the clean and bountiful drinking water we all need. Now, what if we could do this and produce just as many or more board feet of timber? Well, that's what long timber harvest rotations offer. Typically, private industrial forest lands are clear cut and replanted as soon as the trees reach financial maturity. And to answer one of the questions that's already been submitted in the Q&A, this financial rotation age varies by region and species. It's usually younger for fast-growing trees in water-rich regions and older for slow-growing trees in seasonally dry or nutrient-poor regions. For example, 35 to 40 years old is a typical age to log the relatively fast-growing Douglas fir forests that are found in the more kind of wet or moist forests west of the Cascade Mountains. Long rotations, on the other hand, means delaying logging until forests have matured to their timber and carbon potential. Now, the term long rotations means very different things to different people. Sometimes industrial advocates can exploit this to talk about long rotations, but really they're talking about something that we're not thinking about. But on the other hand, my definition is not the same as a lot of ecological foresters' definition. So it's important to be specific. The way I'm using the term today is to refer to harvest ages that maximize the amount of timber a plot of land can produce and the amount of carbon it can store over successive planting and harvesting cycles into the future. So in other words, the maximum sustainable yield, basically. And I call this age the biological rotation age, in contrast with the financial rotation age. For example, compared with a short 40-year rotation, a long rotation could mean waiting to log until the trees are around 80 years old or older. Now, as a side note, you can harvest on long rotations in many different types of forestry contexts. For example, in the variable density thinning forestry context that John was talking about earlier, mixed age selective harvest, or in the context of clear-cut logging. Today, I'll be talking about the latter, clear-cut logging. And bear in mind that just because it's not the ecological ideal doesn't mean that doubling the age of clear-cut rotations on private industrial lands wouldn't be an incredible leap forward. In fact, as a natural climate solution to store more carbon, extending rotations on private lands is probably number one. These graphs, based on modeling done by the Northwest Natural Resource Group, show the amount of carbon stored in a forest and in its forest products as the forest grows and is logged over a 100-year period. The left-hand graph shows successive 40-year short rotations. In an average year, each acre of forest and the wood products it produces store about 57 tons of carbon. The right-hand graph illustrates carbon stored over successive 80-year rotations, where about 87 tons of carbon are stored in an average year. In this case, in this forest, and this was basically modeled on a Southwest Washington forest, the long rotation harvest cycle is storing 53% more carbon than the short rotation harvest cycle is. Good news is long rotations aren't just a good idea in theory. This is my friend Edie Knight in Lynn County, Oregon, and a photo taken by Dan Wilson. Edie manages over 12,000 acres of forest on 80-year rotations. Based on the data she's collected from her forests, she's calculated that they harvest 73% more timber in one 80-year rotation than they would in two consecutive 40-year rotations combined. This photo on the left shows a 73-year-old stand in that forest. You're looking at a living example of how high and sustained income can be compatible with low quality habitat. I'm sorry, with high quality habitat. You can see downed logs, which are so important for housing critters, and you can see the open corridors where you can imagine rodents scurrying along and birds of prey flying in and swooping down. Long rotations are a pretty clear win-win, but they face at least five alternatives, five obstacles. Today, I'll just talk about the biggest obstacle, the time value of money, but you can read about the others on our website at sightline.org. So the biggest obstacle to extending rotation is the financial motivation to log trees as soon as they reach the maximum return on investment. The phrase, the time value of money, means that money received today is worth more than the same amount of money received next year. This is because if we have this money this year, we can invest it this year and it will grow to be more next year. This green bar shows the logical age of harvest if trees were not considered investments that had to yield compound returns. This is the age that maximizes the board feet of lumber produced. The gold bars show the harvest age when investments need to grow, respectively, by 4% or 7%. As you can see, because of the time value of money, trees are cut young. Within biological limits, the higher the return on investment that a landowner wants, the younger the trees are cut. Currently, I'm analyzing how the industry can transition out of this trap and towards longer rotations. The first step is to understand the problem. If long rotations are such a great idea, why aren't people doing it? The fundamental economic problem that leads to short rotation forestry is what economists call market failure. Please don't let your eyes glaze over yet. This part is short, but important. The great thing about markets in theory, and sometimes in practice, is the proverbial invisible hand. By following their self-interest, everyone is better off. In theory, markets cause net gain to society. The way economists see it, when markets don't cause a net gain to society, something's gone wrong, and they call that a market failure. Because of its ecological costs, short rotation forestry leads to a net loss of economic value compared with long rotation forestry, so we have a market failure. Timberland owners are making rational decisions, but the economy as a whole suffers. Talking specifically about the 8 million acres of private industrial forest in Western Oregon and Western Washington, the ecological benefits of growing out short rotations would generate about $40 billion in carbon storage alone, using about $51 per ton as a social cost of carbon. And this $40 billion doesn't even include the water or habitat benefits of longer rotations. In ballpark figures, it would only cost about $16 billion to pay landowners to extend their rotations. When the environmental benefits are accounted for, long rotations would increase the wealth to society as a whole by more than enough to pay timberland owners to delay harvest. Of course, this payment does not actually occur. There are a few circumstances that predictably lead to market failure, such as monopoly, for example, the most obvious one. So when, for example, when Standard Oil gained monopoly control over East Coast railroads back in like 1900, it was predictable that consumers would pay unreasonable and unfair prices. And eventually the Sherman Antitrust Act split Standard Oil into 34 companies. Today, several circumstances predictably lead to a market failure in industrial forestry. Among these are environmental externalities and public goods. Starting with environmental externalities, the short rotation market failure occurs in part because timber companies don't pay the environmental costs of short rotations. In their ledger of all the revenues from selling their timber and all the costs of managing a forest and logging the trees, the negative impacts on habitat, water, and carbon are missing. Economists call these missing costs that are paid for by society but not by timber companies environmental externalities, because they are external to a timber company's profit calculations. They're not on the ledger. A second common cost of market failure is public goods. The ecological benefits of long rotation, water, habitat, carbon, to name a few, have the public good characteristic of being non-excludable, meaning there is no way to exclude people from enjoying them. This causes a free rider problem, since people can enjoy the carbon, habitat, and water benefits of healthy forests, whether or not they pay for them. Most people won't go out of their way to pay and instead would free ride on others' generosity. So even if there were a market, there wouldn't be sufficient voluntary funding to pay for long rotations. And this means that landowners for whom delaying harvest comes at a steep cost can't get paid for their work of stewarding trees through long rotations. Okay, so that's the basic problem. Is there a solution? If you're a landowner, is there a way to extend your harvest rotation without going broke? For members of the public, is there anything we can do to nudge large industrial landowners to grow older trees? There are several excellent solutions that are just beyond our current political thinking, and they deserve our attention. But today, I'll discuss the classics: market forces, regulations, and incentives. Starting with markets, one approach is to create new markets that allow people to buy and sell carbon, water, and other ecosystem services. For example, the Forest Stewardship Council has hashed out the specific rules that foresters must abide by if they want to earn the FSC label and get a premium when they sell their logs. This created an ecosystem good that buyers can actually pay for. Before this label, commodity buyers couldn't tell which toilet paper or which 2x4s were sustainably produced, so they couldn't buy that attribute in the market if they wanted to. Private and government sustainable wood sourcing policies are another tool that creates demand for commodities like FSC. Larger purchases, such as the Portland Airport remodel, a piece of which is shown here, can also shape the nodes all along the supply chain, creating new ways of tracking sustainable wood that didn't exist before, and new practices that can use more sustainable but less traditional products. These kind of market solutions for long rotation timber and other ecological forestry methods have a valuable role. They can spread sustainable wood literacy, and they can help spur supply chain innovation and capacity. But by themselves, they can't achieve the scale of the change we need. One problem with using markets to solve market failures is that they suffer from their own market failures. This could be a drinking game where you drink every time I say market failure. As I mentioned before, carbon storage, clean and abundant water, and habitat are all public goods, and they all suffer from the free rider problem. Because my neighbor, literally my neighbor, isn't forced to buy FSC, he doesn't. Because I'm not forced to buy carbon offset credits when I drive my car, I don't. Without forcing drivers like me, along with factories and utilities, to buy carbon offsets, the price of carbon will never be high enough to get landowners like Weyerhaeuser, Rayonier, Green Diamond, and others to change their practices. To raise the $16 billion needed to extend rotations in Western Washington and Oregon, the price of carbon would need to increase by about 20 times, and the number of buyers willing to pay this price would also need to expand exponentially. Large-scale change is more likely to come from a combination of incentives and regulations. Mandating long rotations through regulations would be politically challenging, to say the least, but it is possible, and some amount of regulation might increase total economic benefits. The devil is probably in the details. For example, the Oregon and Washington state legislatures, or CAL FIRE in California, could amend state forest practice rules to prohibit even-aged harvests, which are AKA clear cuts, in forests that have not reached their biological rotation age. Exceptions could be made, of course, for forest health, climate adaptations, and strategies to ensure that small forest owners are not disproportionately advantaged. The world is complex and good regulations are hard to write. For example, just a small example, you can't tell a tree's biological rotation age just by looking at it. California's forest practices rules gets around this by specifying an average age of maximum sustained yield for different land productivity classes. California's forest practice rules provide some amount of concrete and tested language around maximum sustained yield, but they don't impose binding restrictions for rotation age. Incentives, both carrots and sticks, offer a more flexible tool to motivate landowners to extend rotations. For example, state tax codes could be modified to discourage short rotations and to reward long rotations. I think John was talking about something like this. There was a proposed, this was proposed a few years ago in an Oregon bill, which didn't end up being passed. The bill imposed a new severance tax of 8% on all short rotation clear cuts, with progressively lower rates for older crops of trees. So an 80-year-old harvest, for example, would only be taxed at 4%. Right now, there's a group of Oregonians who are putting together a new kind of bill to do a similar thing. And if you're interested in contributing to their effort, please get in touch with me. I'll pass you along. As a complement to tax incentives and maybe some basic regulations, the public can also pay willing landowners to grow older trees. One way to do this would be for the Forest Service to rent long rotations, the way the Conservation Reserve Program currently pays farmers not to plant on marginal land. A better solution that could lock in long rotations into the future would be to purchase working forest conservation easements from willing private landowners. Pictured here, staff from the Pacific Forest Trust Land Conservancy are hashing out easement terms with a forest owner and prospective easement seller. Conservation easements are, for those of you who aren't familiar, are legally binding agreements that stay with the land in perpetuity, even when the land is sold or passed on to heirs. Easement terms could be written to restrict timberland owners from harvesting trees before their biological rotation age. In exchange for agreeing to the terms of an easement, owners can get cash now, often about half of the market value of their land. So it can be a real win-win. There is a federal program to buy working forest conservation easements. It's called the Forest Legacy Program. It's not currently very well funded, and there are requirements that preclude purchasing easements on kind of industrial out-of-the-way land. But in theory, the Forest Legacy Program could be scaled up enough to purchase long rotations at a landscape scale on all private industrial lands, or any private industrial lands. Depending on land and timber markets, it would cost around $16 billion to buy working forest conservation easements on all 8 million acres of private industrial forest land in Western Oregon and Western Washington. Okay, so wrapping up, in 20 minutes, we've covered a lot. First, a primer on long rotations, which can store twice as much carbon while also increasing timber production. A really neat trick there. Second, we took a quick look at how the time value of money, or the need for forests to yield compounding return on investment rather than sustained income over time, drives landowners to harvest trees young. And remember, the time value of money is only one of several hurdles to extending rotations, but it's the big one. It's the limiting factor. you can't really solve the other challenges without first solving the financial rotation age. I framed the whole problem of short rotations as an environmental economist would. It is a predictable market failure caused by environmental externalities, public goods, nature, or non-excludable nature of carbon, water, and habitat benefits, and the free rider problem. We also thought about what kinds of solutions could extend rotations at a landscape scale. Market solutions alone are probably not going to be sufficient. And our best bet is a combination of paying landowners to extend rotations along with tax incentives and maybe some basic regulations. For the record, environmental economics is an important way to frame the short rotation problem, but to fully understand and solve it, we'll definitely need insights from sociology, psychology, and ethics. So thank you very much and for all you do and for participating with us today.
Thank you so much, Kate. Fantastic presentation. And again, for the participants, the panelists' presentations will be sent out along with a link to the recording. And also the FCC has a YouTube channel. I believe that link was dropped into the chat. I'll also include that link when I send the email out with the recording and the presentations. All right, our last presenter today is Ernie Niemi. Ernie is also one of the founders of the Forest Carbon Coalition, and that was founded, or we were founded in 2013. He's currently the president of the Natural Resource Economics, a consultancy located in Eugene, Oregon. And for 40 years, he's been helping communities in the US and other countries understand the economic costs that are imposed on them by actions that degrade our forests and other ecosystems. And he's been providing guidance to folks to halt these actions. And he's also helped communities understand and pursue the economic benefits for current and future generations from conserving and restoring these ecosystems. So Ernie, I will turn things over to you. Thank you. Ernie, you're on mute. Ernie, can you unmute yourself?
I am trying to do that. Okay. We're running very late, so I'm going to go fairly quickly by talking about some of the lessons we've learned from the Pacific Northwest. Although there is this regional focus, from my experience across the country, the lessons that we've learned here, because many of these issues have been dealt with so intensively here, that these lessons do apply elsewhere. And to summarize what you've heard from John and from Kate, we know that industries are making decisions about forest management to pursue internal profits. So they look at the money that they receive, the money that they expend. But we know that there are these other things called external costs. And I'm not really sure why my screen is not doing this, but the reality is that everybody else is paying these costs. So the corporations can make their profits only because everybody else has to pay the costs that the industry imposes on them. And I will be spending the rest of my presentation describing those. These costs are often not monetized, and that's one of the reasons why the industries can ignore them, because they're focused on money. When we're talking about costs, from this perspective then, we're not talking necessarily about money per se. We're talking about a reduction in well-being for workers, families, communities, and future generations. And I want to be clear that this presentation is not anti-logging, because the economics are very clear. If the benefits exceed the costs, cut the tree down. That's what we should be doing as a society. But we should make sure that we count all of the costs And if the costs exceed the benefits, the cost to society exceed the profits to the business, then we should not be doing that. That makes society worse off. So I'm going to talk about 3 indicators of these benefits and costs. To communities and jobs and incomes, that's because industry often talks about how wonderful industrial timber production is for the economic health of communities and for workers and for their incomes. I'm then going to talk about the value of goods and services, typically the benefits and costs that you see in economic conversations. And then I'm going to talk about risk, because one of the things we are learning from the science of climate change and of the risk to biodiversity is that many of those costs materialize first as risks of things that are bad things that are likely to happen. Now, paying attention to communities and jobs and incomes. Back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, lawsuits acres in Washington and Oregon, Northern California. Logging on those lands reduced by about 90%. Logging in the state of Oregon as a whole fell about 50%. And there was one group that was absolutely thrilled about that prospect, and that was sociological Ph.D. students and sociological professors, because here was a tremendous experiment. We have an industry that's been around for more than 100 years. It is critically important, or what we are told, critically important to the economic well-being of communities, workers, and families. When we no longer log, there is going to be all kinds of devastation and wreck and ruin. And so let's go out as sociologists and describe this. And what can we possibly do to make these communities and workers and families maybe recover a little bit of what they have lost? But then in a retrospective, what we learned was that the timber industry production by the industrial practices themselves have had and will continue to have net negative impacts. In fact, the retrospective published in 2000 by the National Research Council found that in most cases, timber dependency, the more concentrated the timber industry is in a community, the greater the correlation with unemployment, poverty, lower income, arrests, poor healthcare, and the like. And for those of us who lived through this, it was holy crap. We've always suspected this, but here we actually have the information to show that. And again, from working across the United States, my understanding is that these correlations, perhaps not exactly the same, but in general, they apply in all parts of the United States. And then we have jobs and income. Well, the data show, and no surprise here, that the industry really, really, really wants to get rid of workers because workers are expensive. So this graph shows that the number of jobs per million board feet, that's what MMBF means, harvested in Oregon, has dropped from about 12 at about the year 2000, 1998, to almost 6 by 2020. And if the graph has never been prepared, but looking at the data, we're now down around 4. So this is not the source of jobs. This is the source of about 4 billion board feet. It dropped down to about 2.5 billion board feet. But by 2012, we're back up at 4 billion board feet in the state of Oregon. But mill jobs never recovered. Mill jobs permanently dropped by 1/3. So the reason for showing this information, which actually comes from a government institute that is a public relations arm of the industry, this information says that these pressures on jobs, these negative pressures on jobs, are still continuing. And here's one of the things that's going on out there. These machines can do the work of 8 men or more. And I can see this going on about a half a mile from my house. This is research that John published not too long ago that shows for counties in Western Oregon, the higher the timber cut, the lower the median wage in those counties on average. The higher the cut, the greater the incidence of poverty in those counties. Now, the industry knows all of this. So when the industry talks about we have to log, we have to cut in order to have healthy, economically healthy communities, or we have to have jobs, they are in effect implementing a disinformation campaign that is immediately parallel to what we see coming from the tobacco industry and from the fossil fuel industry. Put the lies out there enough time and people will eventually begin to believe it. But the numbers don't lie. And so the reason I am showing you this is that in the Pacific Northwest, in Oregon, around the United States, there will be numbers that show that the timber industry is not correlated with economic nirvana for communities and workers and families. But there's another dimension to this that I really, really hope that you will pay attention to, because you will find this embedded, ingrained in many individuals out in these communities. In fact, you will find it in many political leaders, and you will find it even in university professors. And this idea is that killing trees has economic superpowers. In the mid-1990s, very prestigious researchers from universities in Oregon and Washington published a very detailed, supposedly high quality study that said adding 34 new jobs in a plywood mill in Oregon would have a greater impact on the state's economy than adding an Intel chip manufacturing plant with more than 1,000 workers. And that was a common belief in the industry at the time. And there are, the rest of us hooted and hollered about how stupid that was, but that is still deeply ingrained, so that an article in the Boston Globe yesterday refers to a district ranger for the U.S. Forest Service in Vermont saying we have to log in order to have healthy economies in nearby communities. Again, back in the 1990s, very prestigious economists in this region said the failure to log 44 timber sales on federal lands would immediately cripple and collapse one half of Oregon's economy. And in effect, that's what the district ranger in Vermont is saying. If we don't log, the economies of these communities are going to collapse. Now, these ideas go back into the 1700s, 1600s, even beyond that. And there are all kinds of fancy names for them. But I think this is a very useful name. This is, in fact, cash for carcasses. If we kill nature, we get cash, and that's the only way that nature can help the economy. And the carcasses can be fish, can be logs, it can be dams that kill the natural processes of a river. So what do we know about the value of the goods and services coming from cash for carcasses? What we know from the Northwest and from around the United States, and indeed from around the world, is that industrial timber production has already reduced. It likely will continue to reduce the total value of goods and services derived from forests. So here we have cash for profit, cash for canvas, for carcasses. And I'm going to talk about three types of external costs. Climate, John and Kate have already talked an awful lot about that. Biodiversity, they haven't talked as much, but it's located in their presentations. And then something that we have known for a lot longer, recreation, quality of life, and existence values. So what do we know? From research conducted in 2016 on Bureau of Land Management lands in Oregon, Western Oregon, the market value of a log truck of logs from those lands right now is about $2,500. 2,500. But in producing those logs, and John and Kate have really given an awful lot of information on this, you have CO2 going up into the atmosphere. It promotes climate change. It intensifies that. You have direct economic damage, that is to say, environmental disasters, disease, injury, and death. And then you have slower economic growth because you have these disasters and because many of your families and workers are ill, injured, or dead. And what that tells us is that the damage, the climate cost from that log truck is at least $5,000. That's based on an estimate of the social cost of carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere, the social cost of carbon dioxide estimated by the Obama administration at $50 per ton. New estimates just proposed by the Environmental Protection Agency begin at about $190 per ton, but talk about the possibility it could be as high as $340 per ton. And if so, each one of those log trucks that goes by my house or by your house generates climate damages, imposes damages on society of at least $19,000, at least $34,000. And there's a plus after every one of those numbers because the estimates of the social costs of carbon dioxide do not include by any means all of the costs. For example, they do not include all of the costs associated with the impacts of carbon dioxide on acidification of the oceans. And that's a big deal. So here we see to get $2,500 of profits, perhaps, society bears perhaps more than $34,000 in cost. That's why the industry can earn those profits. And now the biodiversity. Here is a quote from Suzanne Simard, a very the mother tree. What's going on for point out that we have energy system, in particular forest ecosystem, to extract as much as the corporations can extract from them. We are taking as much as we possibly can. And we know that when we stress a system, for example, a highway, or we stress a water system, that last little bit becomes really highly valuable. If you have an awful lot of water, who cares if you have another gallon or not? If you don't have very much water, then that last gallon of water that will keep you alive is worth everything that you possibly can have. And here's some research that actually starts to look at this. And there are more and more economists around the world looking at this. And what they find in this particular study published last year is that we typically have passed the point where the benefits from activities such as mining and logging and industrial agriculture and urban development, those benefits no longer exceed the cost to society. Research that has been conducted under the auspices of the Treasury Ministry of the United Kingdom. This is not a Greenie study, this is the Treasury Ministry, has looked at around the world, on average, the return on activities such as timber production, and compared that to the return on investments in conservation and restoration, and found that the ratio of those is now about 4-to-1, 5-to-1. So that our initial expectation should be that every acre incorporated into industrial timber production is going to produce costs of at least 4 and probably 5-to-1 versus leaving those lands for conservation and restoration. The onus should be on the industry that they should not be allowed to log, therefore, unless they can prove that a particular logging activity on a particular site at a particular time is not subject to this relationship. And now I want to talk about recreation, quality of life, and existence. Economists have looked at this for a very long time. I put this at the end because we have, We don't have really good numbers to compare these for timber, but we have really good numbers for salmon. And in this region, what we see for salmon is in effect a proxy for what we would expect from timber management. And here's what we find from a study in 2008 in the Rogue River in Oregon, that the value of commercial fishing, that is to say, the value of cash for carcasses, was about 1.4 million. The value of allowing those fish to be pursued and part of a sport fishing industry, whether the people catch the fish or not, they enjoy the recreation, is more than 10 times that. But that bottom line says that the existence value of these fish, society's preference to not see the fish go extinct, is 1,000 times, 1,000 times the cash for carcasses value. So cash for carcasses is not some super being, doesn't have superpowers, except it has superpowers to diminish the well-being of society, everyone in society. And now I want to talk about risk. Economists have learned an awful lot about risk in the last 10 years or so as we've started to understand climate change and the biodiversity crisis. And the numbers that we have, the information we have, is that industrial timber production already has imposed, and it likely will continue to impose, huge, huge risks on society. And here are some of them. John and Kate have talked about them. We know that industrial timber production reduces the amount of water in streams in the summer by about half. It increases the temperature of those. It introduces pollution from the use of herbicides. The air is hotter. There's more fire. The fire moves faster. It's more intense. And down at the bottom, we see all of these things of corporate colonization. That is to say, corporations making the decisions about the economic well-being of a community or even an entire region within a state by generating profits for the corporate shareholders and imposing tremendous, devastating costs on the people in those communities. And then there's the corruption. John and Kate sort of alluded to this, but why do you think all of those bills introduced to the legislatures of Oregon and California and Washington have not passed? And this is some information, last two slides, that I find absolutely stunning. It comes from the World Economic Forum, which is one of the premier economic research entities in the globe. This isn't greenies, this isn't tree huggers, this isn't anything. And in 2020, every year they publish what their assessment is of the highest global risks to the economy. And in 2020, it's all climate change and biodiversity. In previous years, it was things such as a currency collapse or the stock market would fail or whatnot. But no, right now they are saying the risks to the global economy, that is to say, the risk to the economy in your community, to your job, is climate and biodiversity. And then look at this. They in effect are saying that the potential impact of climate action failure, the green destruction is comparable to the use of nuclear weapons. These risks are not just trivial. And again, the onus ought to be on the industry to not contribute to these risks unless they can prove otherwise. So thank you very much. I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you so much, Ernie. And thank you again, John and Kate. All right. We did run over, but I did not want to interrupt Ernie's presentation because there was very valuable information that he presented and shared with us. So we do have 20 minutes and I will get through as many questions as we can, and any that we don't get to, we will address later on, and I will send out answers to the participants. So I'm going to jump in. We have a question on growing cycles. Are private forests on a 40-year growing cycle or longer? I imagine there's probably not an easy answer to that, but maybe Kate, do you want to jump in on that one?
Right. Hi. Yeah, I think I answered this in my presentation. The typical conventional financial rotation age depends on how fast the trees grow and kind of their accumulation of mean annual increment curve. And so in the Southeast, they can be harvested typically around like 25, 30 years. It really depends. And in Eastern Washington, maybe 80 years is a typical harvest because they grow more slowly. Here in Western Washington, Western Oregon, they're typically cut around 35, 40 years, but it really depends on the site in addition to the region.
Thank you. A question about wood carbon footprint versus cement and steel. The participant has written that wood has a lower carbon footprint than cement and steel. One, is that true? And two, how do we do this? I guess cutting our logging, the amount of logging that we're doing without increasing our dependence on foreign timber, because we use so much wood currently in building infrastructure.
Yeah, let me jump in on that. It's absolutely not true that wood is less carbon intensive than cement, steel, coal burning, for electricity. The studies that the timber industry has promoted, and there's a lot of disinformation over the years, look just at the energy consumed at like the mills or transportation, just the fossil energy. But when you add the biogenic carbon, the carbon in the wood itself, when it's released, it's not even close. Wood becomes way more carbon intensive than those other substitutes. And these are known facts. This is like documented over and over and over again. A study in Washington by OSU found that annually, all logging related emissions, this includes the fossil and the biogenic releases, amount to about 32 million metric tons carbon dioxide equivalent every year. When you divide that by the board feet that are cut every year, it comes to an emissions factor of like 10 tons carbon dioxide for every 1,000 board feet cut, which translates into a ton of carbon, a ton of wood at a construction site ends up having a footprint of 7 or 8 or 9 tons carbon dioxide per ton of material, where steel and concrete are down around 1 to 2. So that's a big piece of disinformation being put out by the timber industry, that their products are actually less carbon intensive. We all know that they're far more.
Thank you, John. A participant from the Northeast of the US, where clear cuts aren't as prevalent as in the Pacific Northwest, how do the presenter's recommendations translate into a setting where many foresters and landowners are typically cutting 30 to 70% of the trees during each rotation? Does anybody want to answer that question, or how can this information be used in the Northeast where they aren't logging necessarily the same as they are in the PNW? So they're not completely clear cutting tracts of land.
Yeah, I would say it's a definite improvement because you don't have, recall from my presentation that after a clear cut, the land starts giving off more carbon than it takes in for a long period, 10 to 15 years. But if you're not clear cutting and you retain carbon sequestration capacity at the site, that reduces that effect. You're no longer creating a carbon sequestration dead zone. On the other hand, the wood you're taking out is half carbon by weight. And if it's being used for paper or biomass burning, that carbon footprint is pretty big. So it all depends on, and that's the biggest share of wood's carbon footprint, is the actual carbon contained in the wood itself. So even though these alternative techniques, whether it's variable density thinning or selective logging in the Northeast, has a lower carbon footprint, it's still big, though, when you consider the carbon associated with the wood itself. But it is an improvement.
And Heather, if I may jump in here, I appreciate the question. I very much do, but I also need to say that question needs to be raised to the industry and industry supporters. Regardless of how much you remove per acre, whatever percentage, you are still imposing external costs on society. And so the challenge is for the industry to demonstrate that a particular logging proposal on a particular site at a particular time will in fact generate benefits exceeding the cost. So it isn't that if they only take 70% or 30%, is that okay? It isn't okay unless you can show okay, because we are in such an extreme area where the costs of climate, the costs of biodiversity, the impacts on water, et cetera, are just so incredibly high.
Thank you, Ernie. Kate, this question arose from your presentation. They're asking about the FSC. Are FSC sustainability standards really meaningful? And how does FSC define what is sustainable and what isn't?
Oh, that's a great question. FSC is an international organization with different definitions in different countries and different forest regions around the world. So there is a Pacific Northwest set of standards that you can find online. For example, long rotations is not part of those standards, but it kind of essentially gets the same outcome is achieved to a large degree. One of them is one of the criteria around the Pacific Northwest is you can't use herbicides, for example. Now, is FSC effective? It depends how you want to measure or answer that question, but producers who get certified do receive a premium on their logs that has fluctuated over time, and it hasn't been as high as people wanted or expected in certain years, but it has often been worth their effort to get the certification. They've received more as a premium than the work they had to put in. And in terms of kind of effectiveness at a kind of large scale, as I said, I think FSC kind of helped people understand that wood is it's not just that wood is wood. There's more sustainable wood and less sustainable wood. And we have all these food labels like organic, cage-free. You know, back in the day, it was just food, and kind of lumber is still in that kind of bucket for at this point. And so ideas like FSC are very helpful in creating the consciousness that can then get us to some more large-scale solutions.
Thank you, Kate. Next question. Is population growth considered in attempting to apply solutions to long-term logging cycles? So I'm not sure if, Kate, that is a question for you, or maybe John.
Can you repeat the question? Is population included in what?
Is population growth considered in attempting to apply solutions to long-term logging cycles?
That's an excellent question. I think that gets to a wide variety of challenges and shortcomings to knowledge. There needs to be a lot more funding for all of this research. I think, as Ernie kind of implied or mentioned, a lot of the funding for university research comes from the timber industry. And so just like with organics, the funding for ecological practices is insufficient. Population growth is one of many factors that is hard to deal with. It's less hard than kind of substitution effects, feedback effects, any kind of market equilibrium analyses. So my guess is, without knowing kind of which models and which analyses the questioner is talking about, I would guess that it is in some and it's not in others, but very few analyses are kind of full equilibrium analyses. And maybe there'll be more of them. A lot of this is somewhat young. These problems have been going on forever, but hopefully as more literature reviews and kind of meta-analyses come together, we'll be able to combine those variables.
Yeah, I just want to say that, yeah, population growth, we always have to be cognizant of that, but it doesn't mean that we need to consume more wood. Obviously, with fossil fuels, we're in a growing population globally right now, but we're making good progress on reducing fossil fuel related emissions. Nonetheless, there's the same level of waste and overconsumption in wood products. And if we really kind of hammer on that and work on that and fold timber industry and emissions into greenhouse gas inventories and work on strategies to reduce consumption and have more efficient mills, have less waste, we can grow our population while reducing our demand for wood products, and thereby allowing alternatives like long rotations to benefit the land and benefit society and benefit timber supply without creating shortages.
And may I jump in here? It's my understanding that none of us is recommending or demanding that there is only one answer to this. And hence, as population growth been folded into that one answer. Instead, we were saying, let's correct some of the factors that are causing the problem. So for example, the models that describe the potential costs from carbon dioxide emissions, the social cost of carbon dioxide, very clearly anticipate changes in future population. But markets that determine that the market value of a truckload of logs is only $2,500 absolutely gives no consideration to those concerns whatsoever. So let's try then, part of the solution is not to impose an answer, but to start to correct some of the deficiencies that are causing the problem.
Thank you, John, Ernie, and Kate. This next set of questions arise because the person asking wants to be able to counter these arguments that are coming from timber reps. So the questions are mostly directed at you, Ernie, and there's 3 questions. I'll read them all and then I'll repeat them. How do we know that logging causes these negative social outcomes? I see the correlation, but can we be certain that correlation demonstrates causation in all of these outcomes? How do we know these rural communities wouldn't also be suffering due to other rural life trends and factors, even without the logging industry?
Yeah, let me turn that upside down. First, how do we know that the logging industry is contributing to these when rural communities elsewhere are having problems? Absolutely, that's true. But we do know some information that starts to shed some light on this. We've known here in the state of Oregon for a very long time that people move here. So we have an in-migration of people from other places in the United States. And
Ernie, your connection is going in and out.
The other thing I can do about that, thanks for your link. We know that in their incomes, because they find this as a more attractive.
Ernie, try turning off your video. Let's see if that helps give you some more bandwidth.
Does this help?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. We know that people move to Oregon and to Washington and to many communities that have a high quality of life. And stumps, frankly, do not contribute to a high quality of life. There's an awful lot of research that talks about migration patterns in the Western states, but also in the Southeast, that confirms that relationship. And what we are seeing then is the contrast between people who have focused on cash for carcasses as the way for the natural ecosystem to contribute to economic prosperity, to looking at the ability of an ecosystem to attract talent, because talent is now the source of economic growth, economic prosperity throughout the United States, throughout rural communities, throughout urban communities. So that's one. Look at these fundamental things going on. The second, to address the first couple of questions, do we have causation? No, that's really, really, really hard. But do we have an awful lot of information on correlation? There is an awful lot. Again, the experiment that we had in the Pacific Northwest when we reduced logging by 50% shows that communities closer to industrial logging tend to have lower incomes, lower property values than communities comparable communities that are closer to ecosystems and forests that have been protected. So again, it isn't that we can prove causation, but there is so much information out there that now that own us upside down and says, can the industry provide any information at all? And so far they haven't provide any information that points in the other direction.
May I add? It's an excellent question, and it is important to distinguish when we're talking about correlation and causation. The resource extraction, the social effects of resource extraction has been a difficult topic for economists and sociologists over the years. One effective way that sociologists have used is combining qualitative studies where they interview people and they identify mechanisms of causation, and they combine that with quantitative data. And there's a huge sociological literature on boom towns and the effects of resource extraction. And there's very good evidence of specific patterns that occur over and over again that are slightly different by industry and energy and forestry, for example. And there's different impacts in the United States versus in other countries. So it's an excellent question, and there's a lot of good literature answering that question. And I think in timber in the Pacific Northwest or elsewhere can learn a lot from the research done on mining in Appalachia, where you see a lot of the kinds of things that Ernie was talking about, where actual coal production has kept going up while the jobs have gone down. And so the numbers it's hard to see the real thing from the numbers, but when you combine that with qualitative research, our knowledge has come a long way.
Thank you, Kate. Well, we have run out of time, and I just want to thank all the participants for submitting so many questions. We have the questions, and we will work on getting answers to all of these questions. It's going to take some time, so the presentation, the recording, and the PowerPoints, we'll make sure we get those out to folks quickly. I know some of you have hearings coming up that you've asked about the timing, so we'll get that out quickly, but we will need some time. We've had almost 70 questions submitted, so thank you for paying attention and participating. And we'll do our best to get answers to those questions in the next couple of weeks, but we want to at least get the presentation and the recording out to you as soon as possible. So thank you so much to all of our panelists. Thank you, participants, and we really appreciate your time today. And thank you, John. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Ernie. Thank you, Jennifer, for monitoring. And we really, really appreciate everyone being here today.
And thank you, Heather, for an excellent job shepherding us all through this webinar.
You're very welcome. All right, recording is being stopped.